Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of Specimens. My name is Elle, and I am the host of this podcast where we talk all things science, conservation, and of course, specimens. I am going to go straight into it because this is a lovely long episode with wildlife illustrator and author Ben Rothery. I think there's a lot of really insightful and thoughtful contributions that Ben makes in this conversation that I feel like will resonate with people, whether you're in the sciences or you're in the arts or you're in neither. If you are feeling particularly inspired at the end of the episode and you want to find out more about the guest, don't forget there are show notes affixed to every episode, which have links to the social media of each guest and other further reading, articles, press, publications, and all that good stuff, so you can go down a real rabbit hole if an hour's episode isn't enough. And let me tell you, it never is. Ben, I'm thrilled to be speaking with you for my podcast. How are you doing, and where are you at the moment?
I'm doing well, yeah. Sort of running around like a bit of a maniac at the moment, but pretty good. And this is my living room. So I'm in Hackney in northeast London. So yeah.
So for some of the people who are listening who can't see you, your walls are decorated with your own natural history illustrations, and you have many.
No, that sounds like I'm living in a shrine to my own ego. My walls of my apartment are decorated with 2 of my illustrations, amongst many other things, and just the 2 that you can see. But I did those specifically for this apartment, and they were in one of my books that means something that means quite a lot to me, which we can touch on later on. But I'm not sitting in this temple to myself. As you know, sounds awful. But I'm surrounded by plants and artwork, yes.
Okay, well, Ben, I think you might have listened to a couple of episodes, though I could be wrong, but the trajectory for how I like to bring my guests in is to actually go right back. So
nice.
Tell me about little Ben. What did the world look like through his eyes?
Well, I think I sort of was problematic with a butterfly net. I think I kind of was running around sort of flipping over logs and bothering whatever I found under them. And, I was very fortunate that sort of my mum's Afrikaans. So I spent my life sort of going backwards and forwards between, South Africa and the UK, and we have farms in both countries and families spread all over the bush. And so, I was sort of picking up snakes and chameleons and all that sort of thing. But I was a bit of an odd kid, sort of have a rugby ball under one arm and an encyclopedia under another. I was like a sort of a giant, literally, nerd. But yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to grow up and be some sort of, David Attenborough / Jacques Cousteau / Indiana Jones type of character, and that didn't really work out. But that's kind of what I wanted to do. I was fascinated with sort of just stuff, mostly wildlife, but just stuff. It was just an enormous walk.
Well, I mean, you were in such a rich area of biodiversity.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
And that landscape is such a huge contrast to the landscape of the United Kingdom. Do you remember any specific formative moments of being in that type of environment?
Oh, for sure. Like my 5th birthday, we drove across the Namib Desert for my birthday. So it was like we were in the Etosha Pan, like the whole family, like all of us. So it was like dozens of us. And then, my dad gave me like this super powerful set of binoculars, and then we drove from the Etosha Pan like across the Namib Desert to like the Skeleton Coast. So we're up in Namibia, and then drove along the coast. And I'm pretty sure that at the time I was incredibly ungrateful because we were driving in like an unair conditioned Jag with leather seats that somebody had lent my father that he thought was really fancy until we drove across the desert, and then we had hot leather seats and no aircon, and we realized it was a terrible idea. But I was surrounded by stuff like this from a really young age. So yeah, that stuff was definitely formative because I was just immersed in it and surrounded by it. And I had, sort of family who all kind of did their own thing and ran their own thing. So the idea that I would somehow do something connected to this stuff was always a possibility. Like, even didn't have no idea how I was going to get there or whatever else, but it was never like, that's a ridiculous. I mean, I was told it was a ridiculous idea, but in my head it was always sort of plausible and possible.
Ooh, Ben, I'd love to just stop you for a minute and talk a little bit about your choice of words when you say you were taught. And just to give some context to the listeners, I actually connected with Ben in real life at a business design showcase in London. And since we've been connecting online, and I know it's something that Ben, you and I have spoken at great lengths, this concept of being taught that it's art versus science.
Yeah, and what a proper job is as well, all of that stuff.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we will touch on that further down the line in this conversation. But just to your point, did you get that from parents, or was that coming from teachers and academics?
Both. And my folks, yeah. I think mum was super supportive, but mum was kind of like, oh, you can do whatever you want. But without it being ever sort of particularly, focused in, it was super supportive, but not necessarily that practical. And dad, was like, well, you need to do a proper job. And that will involve engineering or law or some numbers. And I've got to take off my shoes to count higher than 10. So that was never going to happen. But I just think, but you're talking about the sort of the separation between sort of art and science. And I just think in my naivety, and it's probably something that really helped, because I'm still naive in that way, is that I don't think I ever particularly saw a difference or a line. And I've been told often that there is one, but I think because the things that I was so interested in were all sort of like Audubon books and, sort of explorers from a time before the one we're currently in, where there was less of a line. You could be a sort of, I suppose, a gentleman explorer kind of wandering around and finding things and drawing them and talking about them and discovering them. And a lack of formal qualification wasn't necessarily a barrier to entry. And so I just, yeah, of course, that's a job that I'll do at some point. And, with no real idea of what that was and how that might sort of come to be. I think, yeah, so...
Okay, so to ask that hard question, how did you go from a love of the natural world into something more concrete?
Time, really. So, I mean, it's sort of skipping back and forth a little bit, but, at school, you have to forgive my ADHD brain as well, because I'll go off on tangents and you'll have to drag me back. But at school, I was sort of not allowed to do art. I mean, I did up to GCSE, but then I cheated on something and my teachers wouldn't allow me to carry it on. And my parents, father mostly, sort of persuaded me that to do proper subjects, you get a proper job. Basically, I wasn't interested in like critical studies, like supporting work. So I just did a load of artwork that was the stuff that I was interested in, which at the time had deviated slightly from animals and was like castles and things, and I just made up a load of artists. When you're supposed to like do stuff in the style of somebody else, so I created an artist I think I called him Grundheim, and I said that the reason that they couldn't find his work is because it was all destroyed in the war, and they just sort of let it go. And by the time the sort of head of art had realised that I was lying, it had already been moderated and gone through, and he couldn't really sort of. And I suppose it's sort of slightly pre-Google. I mean, it existed, but not really. So by the time he realised he'd been sort of made a fool of, it was too late. But it was like, no A-level art, absolutely not. So when I left school, I kind of didn't really have an avenue to do what I wanted, because I was very good at biology, but not so much chemistry or physics, because, as I said, like maths, it might as well be ancient Greek to me. I don't understand it at all. And so I hadn't done any of the sciences, so I could write, I'd done English, and I'd done well at that, but I hadn't done art either, because the school wouldn't allow me to, and even if they had, my folks probably wouldn't have let me either. So I left school with a bunch of random grades for subjects I had no particular interest in, and I just sort of, and I wasn't going to be a rugby player, because it turned out that I can't catch a cold. I can run through a wall, but not very skillful. And so I kind of was a bit lost, really, and I sort of did every job known to man, from sort of being a chef to taking off my clothes, and everything in between. Sorry, publisher, But all of that stuff. But always kind of knowing that what I wanted to do was something to do with illustration, not art, specifically illustration. I was always, the stuff I was interested in was always, sort of really detailed stuff, but it was always kind of with a purpose, I think. And not that fine art doesn't have a purpose, but a very specific purpose, I guess, is what I'm sort of getting at. And obviously, I like other art as as an interest, but not what I wanted to do. But I had no way to get there. So it wasn't until I got to sort of my mid-20s and I'd sort of had enough of everything else I was doing that I put myself through art school. And I suppose I arrived there in a bit of a hurry and then kind of just attacked it. So attacked it with the sort of the mindset, I suppose, of the competitive athlete that I had been. That was like, this is a job and I'm at art school not to faff around and try different things. This is the type of work I want to produce. You're going to make me better at it, which they didn't like. And I took that, from that point onwards. So, I graduated and I did, again, every other terrible job known to man, but it was all to get to here, and gradually sort of shed other jobs until I could just focus solely on this, and then, shed any type of other illustration other than the natural history stuff until I could just basically, I kind of just created a job. I mean, it didn't exist really. It's not, what I've made for myself, such as it is, it's not, scientific illustration in the sense of, sort of illustrating for other people's books and doing diagrams of various other things. I've kind of sort of made myself that kind of Audubon style job of, big, beautiful, fully illustrated natural history books and, sort of drawing all sorts of incredible species and exploring concepts from structural color to convergent evolution to whatever. But it wasn't really a thing. There were a lot of other steps in it, and we can, I guess, go over them. But yeah, it was a very meandering, circuitous path. But through it, I was like, that's where I want to get, but that's not a thing. And so I just sort of blindly forged towards it, and it sort of worked out.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because people who are listening who have been loyal to this podcast and heard quite a few episodes will probably be picking up on this really interesting pattern where lots of people who have arrived at science later in life have come about it through this almost active defiance, being told one thing and then doing another. And it's always this quite convoluted route to get to where they needed to be and kind of learning that as they go, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And also that there's no kind of time frame particularly. There is, I suppose, a bit, but, I left school at sort of 18, 19 with nothing qualification-wise that was remotely useful. Didn't go to uni straight away. Bummed around until I was 24. Well, I didn't bum around. I worked hard, but not with any particular direction. Enjoyed myself probably a bit too much. And then I did 4 years of study, and then 13 years later, I have my own studio and books, and and I'm not sort of super wealthy, but I'm doing all right. And it's the job that I wanted, and I have it. So I was pushing towards when I graduated. So if people are sort of going, oh, I'm 22, 23, 24, 25, and doesn't matter, who cares? I've got some other sort of, a couple of friends of mine that I've sort of met as I've gone through the industry that didn't write their first book until they were like 40, and they're super successful.
Oh yeah, this is something that I come across a lot in my industry, is the desire to be a master overnight. I think all good skills people, all good craftsmen have refined that skill over an enormous length of time. It's all about 100%. Hours, it's all about graft. It's not something that can just be, it's not a gift, it's a skill.
There's no shortcut. It's hours. I think your work's, incredibly sort of skilled, and this is the thing, skill versus talent, right? So I get told often, I'm sure you do, oh, you're really skillful. It's like, no. Or no, it's the other way around, sorry, talented. You're really talented. No, I'm not. I'm skillful. And that came from time. That's practice. That's hours. I think, if I've done this for 13 years professionally, we're giving away how old I am. I think I've done my 10,000 hours, as I'm sure you have, again and again and again. And it's like, you might have a natural inclination towards an aptitude for something, but, where I've gotten to, where you've gotten to, where generally speaking, anyone that's able to do anything well, it's time. They've just put those hours in. So, I think, you get asked often questions by sort of people maybe at a slightly earlier career stage, and they're sort of, how can you do that? I'm like, because I've done it for a really long time. And because I'm really into it, but mostly because I've done it for a really long time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is a conversation that I feel as though you and I could talk about forever. We probably will. But I would like to move away from the sort of theology of these wider concepts and talk specifically about the physicality of your work. So we have touched upon it, but there are people who are listening who might not have come across you. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk about what it is you draw.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned natural history, but what are you doing? Tell us about your work then.
Okay, so animals, mostly wildlife. So I'm a natural history author and illustrator. So I write and illustrate about wildlife. And I work pretty detailed and very detailed. I think in a sort of, hopefully a fairly sort of modern interpretation of quite an old-fashioned sort of process. So my background is printmaking, specifically Drypoint, so etching. So cutting very, very detailed drawings into sheets of metal and then printing from them. And obviously as a it's not obvious at all, but as a method for a commercial illustrator and somebody that doesn't have a giant press in their house or studio, I kind of came up with a way of drawing for myself that captures some of that look and feel aesthetically, but without the requirement for that sort of material. So I use incredibly hard pencils, 9H to F, only the really hard ones, sharpen them almost to needlepoint, and basically cut my drawings into board and then colour them afterwards. So, markers, inks, fine liners, paints, and then more pencil work. And then, latterly I sort of play around with the graphics tablet a bit too. But even then, it's the same process. So line work and then washes, which then gives me the facility that, depending on what the nature of the project is, I can switch back and forth between one media and another. And there's no, I'll tell you if you ask me how I did it, but there's no visual difference between how I did one or the other. It's just a tool for me to use. Because otherwise, there's it's like, oh, that's one of his digital ones, or that's one of his traditional ones, or that's a mixture. It's like, no, they all look exactly the same. And if you ask me, I'll tell you, but you can't tell just by looking at it, which means I can just pick a tool out of the box. Because for me, I'm kind of more interested in the subject that I'm drawing and the information that I'm trying to convey than necessarily the process of how I arrive at that. The process I'm interested in, the media I'm less interested in, I think, is what I'm trying to get at.
Absolutely. And Ben, can you speak to me a little bit about why you feel that natural history illustration speaks or communicates something different to just photographs of birds?
I think on some level, it is a tricky one, but I do sort of have an answer, but it's a sort of half-formed thought. So if it ends up being nonsense, you can call me on it. But I sort of feel like, we have been drawing animals since we lived in caves. And we've been drawing, and we individually have been drawing, or personally have been drawing, since we were tiny children. And it's kind of how we, I think, as a species, on some level at least, sort of explore and understand the world around us. And I think it's something really deep and fundamental in us. And I think, a photograph, go and marvel at sort of the skill of some of the people, sort of like natural history, wildlife photographer of the year and all of that sort of stuff. But I just think there's something, I don't know, I think there's something more human in an illustration, and I think in that, there's it allows people to kind of understand it, and they can kind of see the workings, and they can sort of maybe relate to it a little bit more, than a beautifully polished, technically perfect photograph. And I'm not sure if that's the case, but it's like what I like to tell myself anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ben, I wonder if you think that speaks to how craftsmanship is usually perceived today. So,
I think so.
Very often being a craftsperson feels as though it's something that has been relegated.
Yeah.
And maybe it speaks to the idea of having a real skill, being a draftsman, having, like a fine motor skill. Something along
yes,
those
100%. I think the reason that even in the world, even in sort of 2020 with, super 4K video of everything and a high def camera in your pocket and all the rest of it, not product placement, but there's, the fact that there's still a place for it is because it's something quite sort of fundamental to people, I think, plus I think, from a purely commercial perspective, I suppose if photography is the default visual media and you present somebody with something that isn't a photograph, you immediately have a point of difference. And therefore you have, and in a world where you're sort of competing for eyeballs and attention and sales, having a point of difference, I think is just a little crack that you can worm your way into and try and, so I think from the publisher's perspective, there's a lot of photography, there's less illustration. I mean, there's a lot of illustration, but I think because it's quite an old-fashioned, however up-to-date I like to imagine my style might be, but because it's quite the barrier to entry for the type of illustration I do is time. And there's not necessarily that many people doing it. I mean, there are, but relative to the people with a camera, it's a smaller pool. So you're just sort of, so I think it's twofold, really. But I think the human sort of element of it is maybe the bigger one. Or at least I like to tell myself it is.
And Ben, you mentioned a publisher and you've mentioned some of your books. So I'm going to go straight into it. Tell us about the books, how they came to be, and the objective behind writing them.
Okay. So it's a twofold thing. So I'll go with how it happened and then what they're for. So how it happened was, obviously, as I mentioned before, I kind of graduated slightly cluelessly, but was trying to work towards this particular point. And I couldn't buy a meeting with a publisher sort of out of school, because maybe what I did wasn't particularly in vogue, or even if it was, who the fuck are you? Like, why should we give you a meeting? Sorry. But it's true. And so I kind of went off and I was like, well, I can't, and I was, and I was producing work for, I don't know, everybody from like, sort of food recipe illustrations to the Metro, to drawing people pets, to any work I could get that was drawing, and then supplementing that income with other stuff. And I realized very early on that I couldn't make money that way because my work takes too long to produce. I think as one of my illustration tutors, who I've been trolling for the last 10 years, mentioned, my work is too old-fashioned, takes too long to produce, isn't commercial, and I'll never make a living out of it. I've let that go, obviously. But I've been sending in beautifully wrapped books for the last 10 years. It's wonderful. But the point was, I realized that I couldn't make money that way. So I sort of was like, well, okay, but people are selling things with my artwork on them. So maybe I'll make my own artwork and sell them. So I started making up prints and cards of things I was interested in, which was wildlife, and and I started selling those, and then from like markets and art fairs and all the rest of it, like a smaller local version of the thing that you eventually met me at, and then little independent shops would approach me and go, oh, do you do these wholesale? And I, and as all of us do, you'd be like, yeah, of course I do, yeah, absolutely, I'll send you my price list. Go home, frantically create one. But once you've got a few, then you start contacting other similar shops, and then, not in a linear way, it was obviously a bit more convoluted than that. Those independent shops became a lot more independent shops, and then because I was actively going after it, because I was like, oh, I can make a living out of my artwork this way. And then that became bigger retailers like John Lewis and a few of the others. And then years later, this incredible woman called Shannon Cullen, who was the then publishing director of Ladybird, which is part of Penguin Random House, who are themselves like the biggest trade publisher in the world. Like Ladybird were kind of going through a bit of a rebrand, trying to get away from, the little Ladybird Classics things to start doing, sort of bigger bells and whistles things. And they were looking for people to be part of this. And she stumbled on something I had whacked onto Twitter, and we started having a conversation. And she was like, have you done any books? Would you do any book? Because anytime I got even the sniff of an opportunity, I started talking to this random person on Twitter, looked at her thing, looked at her bio, publishing director, and I was like, hello, we should be friends. And so we sort of, so we got chatting, and, she sort of invited me in for a meeting, and I sort of went along. And my attitude had changed, because when I started out, it was very much like, please, sir, can I have a... And so now, sort of years and years later of having just sort of done my own thing, because I'd given up on the idea that I was going to do books, where I was just making money out of my artwork and doing things I was interested in, and drawing wildlife and all the rest of it. And I was selling products with artwork. And I thought maybe one day I'll do a book, but I'm not necessarily going to get a publishing thing. I was able to go into to Penguin and sort of go, well, okay, have you done a book? No, you haven't done a book, and I'm not sure this is going to work. And able to sort of say, well, okay, I haven't done a book, but my artwork is on products in this shop, this shop, this shop, this shop, this shop. I've done this collection of things with Natural History Museum. I've done these other things, and so I've clearly got the skill to do it. There's clearly a commercial appetite for what I'm doing. So, let's have a talk about it. And, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But clearly there's some appetite for what I'm doing. So I guess I was less of a taking a punt at it than I maybe otherwise would have been. And so that book was Sensational Butterflies, which was in 2016, which should never really have been the first book, actually. It was meant to be the second book, but we did it to coincide with the Natural History Museum's Sensational Butterflies exhibit that they used to have.
Yeah. Was that the immersive kind of butterfly house?
Yeah, the thing outside the museum. Yeah, it was amazing. And they stopped doing it the year the book came out. So all of our marketing campaign was based around launching with the museum in time for this thing, and then it didn't happen. So Hidden Planet should have actually otherwise been the first book. So Hidden Planet is what I kind of call my love letter to planet Earth. So it's a book for the kid that I used to be, sort of absolutely fascinated in the sort of the incredible diversity and wonder of nature. And that's kind of gone with me through my whole life. And so, trying to explain ideas, as I mentioned before, from, sort of how all sorts of different camouflage work, from like motion dazzle to sort of all sorts of things, to different types of symbiotic relationships, to convergent evolution, to structural color, in a way that a 5-year-old can understand it, but it's not so simplified that an adult won't enjoy it, but with really grown-up artwork. Because that's what I was into as a kid. I was the kid where, you'd go on a school trip to the beach, and the teacher would pick up a shell and be like, oh, it's a spider crab. And I'd be like, I think you'll find it's a master crab, and they'd be like, get in the bin. But I got away with it because I could also, tackle people and smash them up on a rugby field. So that's what so that's how the books kind of came about. But what they're for, like I said, is that really, it's trying to sort of, there's a massive conservation angle to all of them, because the idea is that, traditionally in conservation, and it's something that's got leveled at, at the big wildlife charities a lot in the past, is that most attention and therefore money goes towards charismatic megafauna. So orangutans, pandas, tigers, all the big beautiful things, who are obviously super important and and terrifyingly sort of vulnerable, but that is at the expense of the interesting but ugly stuff. The world's most trafficked animal is a pangolin, and most people, other than all 8 species of them, are critically endangered. And unless you're one of the people poaching them, you've probably never heard of them. And so the idea of the books is that you look at the big beautiful stuff, but you also introduce people to how amazing all of this other stuff is. Because if you don't know about it, why would you care about it? And if you don't care about it, why would you do anything to protect it? And so in my small, I don't have an ego about it. I appreciate it. It's an incredibly small impact that I might have. But as an author and illustrator in what is potentially quite a niche sort of subject, it's the only impact I can have, or at least the only one I can have through my work in that way. And then obviously portions of the proceeds of my business go towards different wildlife causes as well. But that's kind of the purpose of the books. And over, and I've done other things for other publishers, but my relationship with Penguin in the publishing sense is the main one, or Ladybird, that's part of Penguin. But they've essentially, with a little bit of a steer from sales here and there, they kind of let me do what I want. Because I think once I sort of delivered the first one and it was good, and I like to think so anyway, and I delivered the second one and we won a few things. And there's an amazing team there, from design to editorial to Dr. Nick Crumpton, who's also an amazing author, but he's, like a sort of zoologist at sort of Natural History Museum. He was at the Royal Society and things. He's been my fact checker all the way through to make sure that I wasn't just doing another Grundheim and making things up. And so, it's obviously a massively sort of collaborative effort, but the person driving it all has been me in terms of the IP, the concepts and the artwork, and they've sort of let me get on with it. And so we're going into books 6, 7, and 8, I think, coming on to that. So I'm working on book 5 at the moment, but we've already got the others kind of teed up, so we know what they are. I can't tell you what they are; they're embargoed, but they are coming. I don't know if I can tell you. I can tell you what I'm working on, but I can't tell you what's coming next. So, so the first one was Sensational Butterflies. The next one was Hidden Planet, which, as I said, should have been the first one, which is quite a broad sort of thing. The third one was Waterworld, because I'm a child and the publisher didn't realize I was naming my book after a Kevin Costner film. And then the fourth one was Deadly and Dangerous, but the idea of it was it's not about, this one has enough venom to kill 100 men and it'll hurt the whole time you're dying. Who's got the biggest teeth? It's more kind of always trying to play with introducing people to things or getting people to re-examine things they think they know. So if I ask you what's the deadliest animal on the planet as a hunter, what might you say it is? And bear in mind, you've got a leg up on most people.
Oh my goodness! Don't do this to me, Ben, on my own show.
But you put me on the spot, so it's my turn.
I would say something like a snake.
Okay, it's a good guess. So most people guess big cat.
No, wait, it's a hippopotamus. It's a hippopotamus.
As a hunter. So they're deadly in terms of they kill things, but they're not hunting things. They are when they get aggressive, but they're not as a sort of way of getting food.
It's going to be something totally left field. Go on, give us the
but most people guess raptor, some sort of bird of prey, a peregrine falcon or eagle, or whatever, or an orca, or a wolf, or a big cat, African wild dog, whatever. It's not. It's a dragonfly. So they've been. If you're smaller than a dragonfly's head, it's going to eat you. And if you kind of look at the success rate of things, a Siberian tiger, the biggest big cat, this amazing thing. 10% of the time they're successful. 90%, roughly 90%, their food gets away. Lions, the same. 10%, 30% when they're hunting together. Wolves, 16%. Wild dogs in the 20s. Hyenas, spotted hyenas, they're in the 60s. They're way better hunters than all of the things that people think hunt better than them. But Victorian explorers decided that, that hyenas were ugly, stupid animals. The reputation stuck. Disney didn't help. But the reality is this animal has better problem-solving intelligence than chimps. They just don't have hands, and we didn't really recognize how smart they are. They're better hunters than lions. Lions steal their food more than the other way around because, of course, you're a carnivore. Why wouldn't you get a free meal? And lions are 3 times the size. So they will nick food. All carnivores will. But generally speaking, they hunt their food. They're led by a matriarch, female. They raise their young cooperatively. They feed their old ones. So there's like sort of evidence of animals that can no longer hunt still being fed by the rest of them. So they don't just abandon them. They continue. The grandparents get to live. And so the whole point of this book is to sort of look at things in a different way. So what does deadly mean? It's actually how animals use speed and intelligence and camouflage and teamwork and all manner of adaptations as well as who's got the biggest teeth and the most venom. And introducing people to all sorts of stuff, and have a different look at this thing that you think actually, and as an experiment, we put a wild dog and a hyena in the book really close to one another. We didn't necessarily say which one was which, and most of the time people misidentify them. So in your head, it's like, well, that's an ugly animal and this is noble and beautiful. But if you don't tell people which one's which, half the time they get it wrong. So it's a thing that's got stuck in people's heads. And so for the book that I'm working on at the moment, it's called Weird and Wonderful. And the idea of this one is, again, sort of looking at things in three ways. So you've got sort of stuff that's obviously weird, stuff that doesn't look weird but actually is really weird, and then stuff that is weird when you look at it. So, there's in the obviously weird category, you've got things like, tardigrades and these little extremophile animals that, you can sort of boil and freeze and shoot into space and they don't die. And then, in the sort of doesn't look weird but actually is category, you've got things like woodpeckers. So, you look at a woodpecker in your garden, seems normal. It's just a little garden bird, but, it hammers its face into a tree 200 times a minute with about 120 times the amount of force it would take to knock out an adult human being. And that's how they get their food. And the way that they achieve this is that they've got a whole series of adaptations, including a tongue that wraps all the way around their brain and acts like a seatbelt inside their skull. Very weird.
They're great to work on.
I would imagine. I've seen a couple of them. They're amazing. So have you done a Greater Spotted one? I've just drawn one for the new book. Beautiful.
I have indeed.
Absolutely.
They are stunning birds. Sorry, but I interrupted. I want to know the third part. That's weird to look at.
Isn't weird, but doesn't seem weird, but actually is. So an elephant. Elephants are fucking weird. The only reason we don't think they're weird is familiarity. Mm-hmm. But if you stop to think about it, you have an animal that can weigh up to 8 to 10 tons, has armored skin, has a nose that it's still a nose, but it's also got 400 individual muscles in it, can have the same manual dexterity in the case of an African elephant as a human hand, so they can just pick stuff up and manipulate it. So it's a nose, but it's also a hand. And they can use it as a drinking straw and a communication device. They cool themselves with their ears and they can hear through their feet. So if somebody, they don't... Hearing is a bit of we're sort of playing with sort of semantics, really. So obviously hearing is sound waves. And they can sense sound. They can sense vibration through they've got a massive gel pad in their feet, which essentially does the job of an ear. But if nobody had ever seen an elephant and then one got made up, that's really fucking weird. So the whole book is things like that. And then the next ones are in a similar sort of vein of sort of going, look how amazing all this stuff is. Care about it. And sort of trying to sort of jump back and forwards a little bit between, but also trying to have a little bit of a sting in the tail of well, here's a white rhino. There's only 2 of them left. The species is dead. They don't even realize it yet. Because the idea of, rather than sort of going, this is fucked and this is fucked and this is fucked, sort of go, look, care about this. Isn't it amazing? Unfortunately, because maybe, if you get people to care about it and then you give them the little sting, they've already kind of formed an emotional response with it and they care. It's that thing of, if you've got somebody to care about something before they realise, they don't have the chance to kind of switch off and put a wall up. So that's kind of the idea of what the books are for. And then as we've kind of become slightly more successful as a studio, I keep using the we, it's not a royal we. So it's me, I'm the one that does it all, but I've got an amazing team in my studio and we have a retail space and they kind of facilitate the whole thing to run now. And it just allows me to mostly, when I'm not screaming and shouting at people, not my team, other people, allows me to do this stuff. But the idea now, through the business is that, we'll continue to produce these books and prints and stationery and all the rest of it off the back of it. But then, as well as doing the education side of things through the book, we're now parceling off bits and pieces of money and putting them into things. And I've kind of got enough resources to be able to do things like the Into the Red book from the BTO, when they sort of asked if I would contribute to it. Yeah, so this is so the British Trust of Ornithology put together, this is their second one. It's a book of, so the red list is this time round is 70 birds, British birds, things that we imagine are common, starlings and sparrows and things that are now, vulnerable to critically endangered. And 70 of them have gone on the list this year, up from 60 something the last time they did this book. But all of the proceeds from the book go to supporting conservation projects to do with the different species in it. And they got 70 artists and 70 sort of writers and other people to contribute to it, from like Adam Buxton to Mackenzie Crook to unimportant people like me. But they got a broad spread. But I'm in there. But I was able, but I could do it for free. And I could donate my fee, and we sold the original for, to put money into it as well. And we're selling the book in the shop, and we're giving the profit from the book goes back to the charity. So we're able to kind of do stuff that, 10 years ago me couldn't do. We give money to like the Namibian Pangolin Conservation Group for who work in Namibia, as the name suggests. Sort of rescuing pangolins, and so we donate the profit. We've got like a pangolin illustration that's on a card and a print, and all the money from that goes to them and other bits and bobs. So it's really fun, but it's all come out of the book.
Ben, you are the busiest of men, and I know you have
trying to
so many things that you are doing that require you to be high performance, but I do want to talk to you about something that I know you've been quite vulnerable and open about online, and that is your struggles with imposter syndrome. So,
100%.
Essentially just sharing when that rears its head as somebody who is so busy,
100%.
And how you cope with those struggles, if you're happy to talk about it with me.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I just think that I think quite often, if you, me, sort of others sort of present quite a polished front in terms of the quality of the work you put out. Maybe that sometimes means that people don't imagine that you, kind of can have a bit of a touch of the black dog, or, can have some pretty dark moments, or sort of think, why the fuck am I doing this, or what's the point, or whatever else, I mean, in the whole story, it sounds as though there's been this sort of linear sort of progression, sort of march towards, success, Bill. And I'm not there. And at various points, I've gone bankrupt, between graduating and now, I sort of lost my home, and various other things along the way, but I'm sort of I'm too stubborn to give up. But it's, and at other points, even sort of, even now sometimes, you sort of, especially not having, a qualification behind it, strictly in the area that I'm working. Some of the people that I'm sort of now rubbing shoulders with are, they're proper scientists, and they're, we're doing stuff at, we did stuff with Natural History Museum, and I've got a new collection launching with WWF this week, and the books, we're talking about things, and there's this constant sort of, I suppose, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or somebody to sort of realize, you're just a meathead who can draw, and it's sort of, I think the thing that's sort of gotten me through it has been, I think we all have our own way for it. Mine was been, sort of, I carried on competing as an athlete sort of the whole way through. So when I stopped playing rugby because, I had shit hands to start with anyway, and I couldn't risk breaking them anymore. But I've always been sort of quite physically competitive. So I got into strongman, weirdly enough. So I sort of pick up cars and rocks and logs because, of course, no, like normal weightlifting, I'm too much of a hipster. So I found like I'm one stripy unitard away from being sort of fully the most hipster form of weightlifting. But it gave me an outlet for just general feelings of sort of anxiety and angst and depression, which I do struggle with from time to time. And it gave me linear progression. This week I'm doing this thing 8 times. Next week maybe it's 9, or maybe it's still 8, but it was easier than last time, or whatever. And it's and you have a sense of control when everything else is chaos. And you have, in my specific instance, if I'm trying to, I mean, it's not an ego trip. I'm a very small, very average strongman. But if you take a couple of 100 kilos and you put it on your back and you sort of step out on a stage in front of people and you're sort of putting it all on the line, the world becomes a very small and simple place. There's no deadlines. There's no, fuck, am I going to get it wrong? Can I do it? Is this person going to pay their invoice? Because if they don't, I can't pay my suppliers or my mortgage or my rent or my staff or whatever else. There's you and there's the thing and there's nothing else. And it becomes a weirdly meditative. And that's a bit of a mental dump. And I just sort of, but it doesn't go away. You just sort of manage it. I know you've spoken really openly about it, and I really really admire that. I don't know if I always do that as well as I perhaps ought to, but I'm quite I'm a weird sort of contradiction of, look at me, but also I don't want to talk to you and I don't want you to know anything about my life.
Sounds like you're an extroverted introvert, which I can definitely attest to.
Correct, I am, yes. I control my introvert ways by taking over any social situation in which I find myself, and therefore don't have to manage my crippling anxiety that I don't want to be there in the first place. Yeah, so if I'm jumping up on a table and taking my clothes off, it's actually because I don't want to be there, fully dead inside. But yeah, it doesn't go away. And I think that's really important. When you sort of speak to a student or somebody sort of starting out trying to get into it, it's like you can't soft soap it. Like it is difficult. It doesn't get easier. You just learn to manage it, and you don't always manage to manage it. Sometimes it just squashes you, and then you have to sort of pick yourself back up and get on with it again. But there's not. I wish there was a sort of, you do this, this, and this, but I've got my way, which generally involves lifting heavy things and screaming.
Cathartic.
It is cathartic, but and it's actually quite a good companion to have something that's, other artists, you have a job that is very solitary, sedentary, and in your head. So to have something that is the exact opposite of that, where it is physical, not really cerebral. I mean, it is in the sense that you have to be intensely focused, but you're focused in such a specific way that your brain isn't sort of, brass band clashing cymbals, sort of, fuck, you're just sort of, you're actually you're super focused on this one thing.
Yeah.
And you're around other people who often are much better at it than you, but there's a sort of competitive but collaborative thing. We're like, my training partner Steve, a very good friend of mine, much bigger and stronger than I am. I've got a bigger engine, but I had to get that in there. But the reality is, I'll lend him kit, or I'll strap his knees before he goes and does an event, even though he and I are competing in the same event against each other. And if I strap his knees too well, I'm actually helping him beat me. But that doesn't matter, even though I desperately want to beat him. But I want to beat him because I beat him, not because I didn't wrap his knees properly. But it's so different to the day job, which is, I'm very lucky that I have a studio and I have a team and all the rest of it. When it comes to actually producing my work, in a similar way to you, I am on my own, in my head, and it takes a really long time. And there is no shortcut to that. And when you are in your head, on your own for a long period of time, all of those sort of, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? I'm no good. What's the point of this? I haven't been paid for X amount of time, whatever else, like what, I'm this amount of years in, when does the reward come? Like that, it's very hard to avoid those feelings because you're just there with it. Like, and there's no, okay, well, cool, you're on your own, be around people. Well, I don't work that way. I have to be on my own. I need the space. I need the solitude. I need the whatever. Or we'll do it faster. That's not how it works. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know how you deal with it, but I don't know I entirely deal with it all the time, to be honest. I think I just sort of, live with it, and when it's shit, it's shit, and I sort of cope / compartmentalize the rest of the time. And then sometimes it's good. And I think my other coping mechanism was just to sort of to find sources of passive income, which I think I'm very lucky in, where it wasn't, I think I'm super lucky in a way that somebody that produces individual pieces like yourself or another artist, they can't do that in the same way, where I'm like, well, I produce a piece of artwork once and then it goes in the book and the publisher pays for the book, but I very carefully, I'm very careful. Also, advice to everyone: own the rights to everything you do. Don't ever give your rights away. They don't need them. They'll say they want them. They don't fucking need them. If they do want them, make them pay for them. Because I've done that, I have an image library of 13 years worth of work, and I can do what I want with it. So that same artwork in the book, without being really gross and making billions of copies of everything and all the rest of it. But the artwork becomes a beautiful print. Maybe it's a card, maybe it goes on a fabric, maybe we stick it on a tea towel or a tote or whatever. Every time the book sells, I get a tiny, infinitesimally small, really sad little nugget. But it all adds up, and over a period of time, you're having to you're still having to work hard and graft and all the rest of it, but some money is coming in, even if you're not, or even if you have a week when you just can't make your brain concentrate on anything and you're just there like, what's the point? Whereas when you're thing to thing to thing, it must be so much harder for somebody sort of like yourself, where it's like, well, if I don't do this thing,
you can't stick it in a printer.
No, exactly. Stick it in a printer, how dare you? That's not how it works. It is a bit. It is a little bit. But no, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I've remotely answered the question, but I don't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think it's a very honest answer, because I don't think there is.
I don't think there's an answer.
No, absolutely.
You know what? I listened to I think it's really true of artists as well as actors. So I'm stealing something from Richard E. Grant, who is much more articulate and erudite than I. But he was basically saying that all actors are a curious mix of enormous ego and crippling self-doubt. Ego to think that you could or should do this frivolous and ridiculous thing, and self-doubt to imagine that you could or should do this frivolous and ridiculous thing and make a living out of it. And I was like, me, that's me. I'm there. So I think you're totally right. I think I just think it goes with the territory a little bit, and I think sort of recognizing that and telling and admitting to yourself that it's okay with that, I think, is a huge benefit. And it doesn't make it easier when you're in it, but I think the sooner you can accept and acknowledge that, the easier life becomes, I think.
I think it can also be enormously compounded by the feeling that we are just straddling two disciplines and we don't really fit into one.
Yeah, 100%.
Are we validated by the sciences, or are we validated by the arts? Or are we...
Or not really either, because you're not a proper artist, because there's nothing super conceptual about what you're doing, and you're not a proper scientist. And it's like, well, actually, I'm what I am, you're what you are. That's fine. And also, we live in social media land where everyone's presenting the most perfect and polished version of themselves. And the reality is, I present a perfect and polished version of myself, mostly, and sometimes. But it's commercial. My social media presence is buy my books, buy my prints, buy my art, and I try and have a bit of integrity with it and let people in behind the scenes and all the rest of it. But ultimately,
it's a shop front.
It's a shop front. And you're presenting a version of yourself that you want the public to see. And sometimes, yes, you try and, share a bit of warts and all. But if you only shared warts and all, or shared how often there are the sort of the dark side of things, people, they are not gonna be, they're not coming along on that ride. They're just not. So so you're constantly comparing yourselves to people who are, well, that's not real. They're not real. Nobody's like that. I mean, unless they're a sociopath, like, which has been leveled at me. But
well, Ben, I feel like we've covered so much territory, and there is still so much more territory that we could talk about. But as we come to the end of the episode, I just wondered if you could share in maybe hopes for the future, whether that be your own personal future as an artist or maybe something greater for the climate or for conservation. It doesn't have to be, but what is your mission statement going forward?
I try, and it's going to sound really bleak, but it's not meant to be. I try and sort of keep one eye on sort of the bigger things, while simultaneously not trying to think about them too much, because otherwise it would be crippling, because the world is, to a greater or lesser extent, slightly fucked. You and I work with wildlife, and as the sort of WWF sort of report just sort of covered, we've lost 69% of all wildlife across the entire planet, on average, since the 1970s. Following that trend, it's not going anywhere good. The fact that I've just contributed to this, and this one is worse than the one they did 2 years ago, is not good. So I sort of try to do. I'm very happy that my career is going in such a way that I'm able to sort of do more and more little pieces of good. And as a business, we do all sorts of things. From, obviously, I'm producing the books and the IP and all the rest of it, and I hope to continue to do that. And I've got some really incredible books coming along that you guys get to find out about soon. And there's the new thing we're doing in WWF, and that's launching soon. And the profits from that, or at least a big portion of them, get rolled back into conservation things, and we sell them and they go to conservation things, and we sort of try and educate people as best we can. And, we now sell plants in our studio shop, and, we try and educate people about those, because the dirty secret of the plant trade is that, 50% of all plants are dead within a month, because you've got shops that don't know what they're selling to people that don't know what they're buying. And we try and fix that. And so trying to do, I'm trying to set up a conservation project back in South Africa, with some of the profits from some of the things that we do. So there's a specific habitat in the Cape called fynbos, which is like 500 species of endemic shrubs and herbs and things that don't grow anywhere else. And they are the habitat in which that sunbird lives. And they're super vulnerable, because fire is part of the life cycle of those plants. So basically, it requires brush fires to go through and burn out some of the plants so they can renew. But it requires fires to be hot and fast. They blow through and go. It can't tolerate the fires happening too often, and it can't tolerate them being stuck in one place. So when the settlers arrived, they planted loads of oak trees and pine trees and pretty things from Europe, which was fine until, sort of climate change meant that wildfires happened more frequently. And it means that when they happen, the fire hits an oak tree, and instead of blazing through and disappearing off into the next valley, and then the plants can regrow and regenerate, the fire sticks and it burns in that one spot and it kills everything. So there's a bunch of projects happening to basically go out and dig out all of these non-native trees, because you can't. I mean, you can. Hopefully, one day we will, as a species, solve climate change. But in the small intervening sort of time, perhaps there's a way that you can mitigate some of its effects. So we want to try and set up a project like that. And my sister, who works with me, she's back in South Africa at the moment. I've employed family and friends and various other people within this thing. That's part of the royal we. But she's going to set up a couple of things, and then in the new year, I'm going to head over there and try and get involved in an existing project. And I'm talking to a couple of people, or set up our own. On a personal level, trying to do lots and lots, while trying to be successful with it and have a good life, but trying to sort of do as much sort of good in as many little ways as we can. But my hope is that, that we as a species get a fucking grip. But I can't control that, so I can just try and be hopeful and not think about it too much, and then do the little small bits that are within my power to actually to try and affect some sort of small bits of change. So that's kind of my sort of hope for the future, I suppose. being hopeful without thinking about it too hard, because otherwise I'll freak out. I don't know.
Well, Ben, not only are you hilarious, but you're also doing wonderful work. And I have no doubts that people listening to this will not only resonate with some of the hardships, but also be enormously inspired by you. So thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Oh no, thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, I hope it's vaguely usable, but no, it was an absolute pleasure. So I love what you do. I think it's brilliant, and I think more people should know about and listen to the pod. And I'll never say no if somebody gives me an opportunity to talk about myself, because I'm in.
Thank you so much to Ben for giving up his time so generously. If you're still here, I imagine you would love to hear the links of where you can find Ben and his amazing work. Check him out on Instagram. It's instagram.com/BRIllustrations. That's BR Illustrations. You can find prints, books, and so many other goodies via his website. That's benrotheryillustrator.co.uk. If you would like to find me, I'm on Instagram at Elle Kaye Taxidermy, and the podcast is at Specimens Pod. I'm also on Twitter, Elle Kaye, just the initial taxidermy. If you'd like to support this podcast by pledging just £1 a month, that's via our Patreon. That's patreon.com/specimenspod. Looking forward to speaking with you next time. See you in 2 weeks. Take care.